All right, good morning, guys. Today we're talking about rounding decimals to any place using our place value understanding and a vertical number line. So we're going to be looking at numbers and deciding, all right, is this number closer to this or this? And this or this is going to be whatever unit we might be rounding to, whether it's tens or ones or even on the decimal side, tenths or hundredths, what have you. We're going to start by looking at a whole number problem. So in this problem, we're asked to round 155, and we're going to round it to two different place values. So the first place we're going to round it to is our tens place. And it helps if we can convert this number into different unit forms. So in our normal way of reading this number, we would read it as 155. We can also look at this number and name it as groups of tens and ones. So 155, how many groups of tens are in 155? Well, there's 15 groups of 10, which is 150, and 5 ones. So 15 tens, which is 150, and 5 ones, it's the same as 155. And if we were going to rename that number in only terms of ones, it's 155 ones. So those are three different ways we can write it in different unit forms. Now this is going to really help us when we look at the decimal side and understand that we can rename by grouping by hundreds, grouping by tens, grouping by ones. We see that there's one group of 100, 5 tens and 5 ones, or 15 tens and 5 ones, or just 155 ones. So if I asked you to round this number to the nearest 10, looking at our chart here, which of these decompositions do you think is going to be most helpful in deciding between what two tens 155 is? Now a lot of you probably already know this, and you probably understand that 155 is going to be between 150 and 160, but why is that? Well, this right here, this decomposition that shows us it's 15 tens and 5 ones, this is going to help us understand better that it's really between 15 and 16 tens. So when we know that, we can make a vertical number line. And I've written here 15 tens and 16 tens. I know that somewhere between there, 155 is. So I look for my midpoint. Well, what's the midpoint between 15 tens, which is 150, and 16 tens, which is 160? We know that between any group of 10, a midpoint is going to have a 5 in it. In this case, it's 155, which is the same as our number. Now, what do you do when you have the same number as the midpoint? Do you round up or down? I mean, it's exactly in the middle. And the answer is when it's exactly in the middle, just like with whole numbers, you're going to round up. So 155, rounding to the tens, is closer to 160. Okay, let's try rounding the same number to the hundreds place. And I'll ask you again, which one of these decompositions is going to be most helpful in understanding between what two hundreds 155 is? Remember, this one helped us know which two numbers, between what two tens this number was. What number is going to help us see between what two hundreds it is? All right, if you had time to turn and talk to somebody, I'm hoping you guessed that this top one will inform us between which two hundreds 155 is. We see that there's one group of 100, and then we have 5 tens and 5 ones. It's not at 200, but it's over 100. So 200 is going to be our top. 100 is going to be our bottom. I could write that as 2 hundreds and 100. And now we're deciding which is 155 closer to. Is it closer to 100 or 200? Well, let's think about what's our midpoint between 100 and 200. Like I said, there's always going to be a 5 between any groups of 0 and 10. So 10 tens and 20 tens. What's between 10 and 20 is 15 tens. So we can write 15 tens or 150. So knowing that that's 15 tens is also going to help us. Being able to translate between different unit forms and being able to name them in different ways is going to really help us to be able to understand these numbers. So 150 is our midpoint. Where would our number 155 sit on this vertical number line? we're getting larger as we go up, and here's our midpoint. I know that 155 is obviously larger, slightly larger than 150. So in this case, our number is going to round up. Remember, the midpoint or above will round up to the next number. All right, let's try this with a decimal. It's a very similar looking chart. We've only moved down to the ones, tenths, and hundreds. And now I'm going to ask you, between what two whole numbers is 1 and 57 hundredths? If we're deciding between what two whole numbers, this decomposition is going to give us the most information. It's going to be between 1 and 2. So we can make a vertical number line. I'll put my whole number 2 up there. I'll put my whole number 1 down here. We're going to try to find a midpoint. Now, between 1 and 2, we may know what the midpoint is, but what is 2 wholes? 2 wholes is actually 20 tenths. And if you don't believe me, if we had a place value chart, and this was the ones, and this was the tenths, and I wrote 2, 2.0 is the same as 2, that's 20 tenths, right? And so 1 would be 10 tenths. And although some of you may know the midpoint between 1 and 2, it just helps with understanding. We know the midpoint between 10 and 20 would be 15 tenths. What is 15 tenths? Let's see. 15 tenths can also be called 1 and 5 tenths. So 1.5 is our midpoint. Now our number is 1.57. Let's compare 1.5 and 1.57. Here's 1.5, and here's 1.57. I've told you guys before, if you have decimal numbers with different numbers of digits, you can always add zeros to say that, so that you're comparing them to the same unit name, in this case hundredths. 1 and 50 hundredths, 1 and 57 hundredths. We could also say 150 hundredths, 157 hundredths. 157 hundredths is more than 150 hundredths. So it would be somewhere up here. And because it's above the midpoint, it rounds up to the 2. The next problem is the same number, and I want you to round to the nearest tenth. Which one of these is going to tell you, which one of the decompositions is going to best tell you between what numbers of tenths it is? Well, this one right here. Because 1.57 or 1 and 57 hundredths can also be named 15 tenths and 7 hundredths, or it can be just called 157 hundredths. These are 3 different ways to show this number. But this particular decomposition tells us it's going to be between 15 and 16 tenths. So the big number, the larger number goes up here, 16 tenths and 15 tenths. And we need a midpoint. Well, what's the midpoint between 16 and 15? I don't know, but I know what the midpoint is between 160 hundredths, because 16 tenths is the same as 160 hundredths. And if you don't believe me, here's 16 tenths. Remember the ones, the tenths, and the hundredths. Here's 16 tenths, and here's 160 hundredths. And they're the same. Remember, I told you we can use zeros to fill in so that we can call them by the same name. So we can say this is 160 hundredths, and this is 150 hundredths. Much easier to find the midpoint between 150 and 160. It's 155 hundredths. So we have 155 hundredths as our midpoint, and our number has 157 hundredths. Again, it's going to be somewhere around here. Again, it's above the midpoint. So it rounds up, but it rounds up to 16/10, which is 1.6. It rounds up to 1.6 or 1 6/10. All right. The last thing I'm going to say, I won't do any more examples, is this is very similar to, it's actually, it parallels our metric conversion chart. If I asked you how many centimeters is 1 57 meters, well, if it's 1.57 meters, it's 157 centimeters. And that's because on the metric conversion chart, hundredths would be centimeters, tenths would be decimeters, and the ones would be our base unit or meters. And we can use that place value chart to very easily do metric conversions.